Astralis are the reigning major champions. And this is a team where the core lineup has been at a level to win majors since literally the second major we had, EMS1 Katowice, way back in 2014. But that core famously never even made the final of a major. They made it to semi-finals, they were always in the playoffs of the majors, but they were a team where they always suffered from something in terms of the in-game leader, the guy who brings it all together. So they had this player fetish, legendary source in-game leader, and with him, they were able to develop these fantastic CT sides. They had a great defensive setup. All of their players were high impact players. They were players who were very skilled, who were some of the best in the game. And the skill level man for man in the team was always very impressive. But they lacked something when it came to that tactical execution. Something was missing in the lineup. So then you go forwards, you go to 2015, and now they get Carrigan, someone who used to be like a second or a third star type player in CS 1.6, hadn't really been much of an in-game leader until CSGO, hadn't necessarily been a fantastic in-game leader, but they needed a change. So they brought him in, and he really developed their terrorist side. He developed the offensive side of play, and he figured out how to use some of the different players in a different way. Suddenly Cajun B was more effective. Eventually Zipnix really came out as one of the best support players we had in the game. Device was already the star player, but he blossomed even further. And so then they were a team where they had this classic storyline where they could be any team in the world and they could win any tournament as long as that tournament didn't have the most prize money and didn't have major written next to it. And the same team that they could beat before the major and after the major, if they met that elite level team in the semi-finals, they would lose to them. That was always the case. And as such, yes, you look at those other teams, and those are some of the best teams of all time. Those are teams that went on to win majors. But you also look at those teams and you say they were beatable for Astralis in the past. So what changed? And what usually had changed was they had this element of nerves that would implement itself only in the big game like that. They would choke, they would get nervous, they couldn't execute their own game plan. People would play scared, people would play overly passive when before they were supposed to be aggressive and create a play in that situation. People would retreat and they'd create the space that the legendary teams, they're going to exploit those weaknesses. So what changed about Astralis when they got Glaive into the lineup as the in-game leader is this was someone who not only could harness the players in his team, which was always some of the best players, not only could develop a good offensive side, a good CT side, not only could do all the basics, but the key element was he brought the final piece of the philosophy that has allowed the team to have this level of success they've had. Where in the 9 tournaments they've played with Glaive, they have always made the semi-finals. They have never failed to place top 4. And part of the reason why they can do that, so that means there's been tournaments where they didn't have a great time, where things were going badly, where they were losing, certain star players weren't playing up to par, but they always make it to this point of the tournament where you have a chance to win the tournament because they have this central philosophy they can return to. And that's this very fundamental way of playing the game, which is simple Counter-Strike. It's simple in nature, but to actually execute it requires a lot of discipline. And so that's the other thing. They're fundamentally very sound, but they're a very disciplined team. And what that's allowed them to do is when they play the big opponent, when they're in a tough match, rather than have to think, do I have to make a play at this moment? Or am I playing the right way right now? Or is the opponent being too aggressive? Instead, you always return to that core philosophy of what's the basic fundamental approach we're trying to take right now. Within this tactic I'm doing now, what is my job to help this guy next to me succeed? Or how do I set up that guy so that he can help me succeed later in the round? And by returning constantly back to this has meant that even when they are at sea, this is kind of the piece of the wreckage they can hold on to and survive longer. And then, with you have as good players as Astralis does, you're going to have games where you hit that high peak and the tactical element can overwhelm the opponent, because this is maybe the best tactical team we have in the game at knowing their own tactics and how to execute them in a match. And so we've seen, not only do they finish top 4 in every tournament, but they've won numerous tournaments. They've beaten almost all the best teams in the world. They've been able to get a very deep map pool because of this fundamentally sound tactical approach, where even on the maps that you look at the bottom end of their map pool, you say, that isn't their best map. You know, they're not going to be beating the best team in the world on that map. They can play anyone though on those maps, because even if they only have a few tactics, they'll know how to make those tactics work. They'll know why that tactic is constructed that way and how it's executed in the match. So whenever you talk about Astralis, the first name that has to come to mind has to be Device, because this is someone who's been kind of the problem child of Counter-Strike For almost as many years as he's been playing at the top, since 2014 onwards, he already had the skill level, the capability, the potential to be the best player in the world. But just as he was held back on a psychological level and couldn't actualize himself and kind of activate his skill in the game at all times, that was the same story of Astralis. And he was a guy who had to battle, not with his skill level, he had it all already, not with whether he AWP'd or whether he rifled. He was always a very multifaceted, talented player. What he had to battle with is the mental challenge of how do I get to my peak level in the toughest games? And so when he was unable to do that in the early years, yeah, his team suffered as a result. But as they began to win, he began to become this player who not only was one of the most skilled, but one of the most consistent. And over the last few years, his level of consistency, tournament to tournament to tournament, there's maybe one or two players ever who've hit that kind of level and maintained it consistently throughout that time period. Then you've got to add in, this is someone where you just give him a rifle, he could be the best player in the world with a rifle. But in this team, he's famously made his role more known for AWPing, actually. He's someone where he's not the best sniper in the world, but he's one of the most effective snipers in the world. And part of that comes from the fact that he doesn't just rely on his talent as a crutch. This is a guy who studies the game a lot, who studies what his opponents are doing so he can figure out where are their weak points, where can I actually set up a favorable situation for myself. He even studies himself in the same way to think, if the opponent was watching what I did right now, where would they expect me to go? Where would be my weak point? Where would they be able to push me where it would be a difficult situation for me? And knowing those two boundaries and being able to play within it, I feel like that's what's made his AWP one of the most effective in the world. And it doesn't matter that he won't kill all 5 players in a round with it. The 1 or the 2 kills he might get might be the key kill on the other AWPer. It might be the key kill, that entry that opens up a site that allows the rest of his team and that tactical style to absolutely destroy the site and to get around that otherwise would have been very tough, would have been very borderline question mark round if you didn't get that one crucial kill that opened it all up for you. The problem though that Device has is even though he's hit this incredible skill level and he's really developed his game and he's figured out his style, he still has kind of a rung left on the competitive ladder of accomplishments because he's not trying to compete to prove he's the best player in Astralis. He's not trying to show he's the best Danish player. He's not even trying to show he's one of the best players in the world. He has been all these things and he is all of these things. His problem is he's competing with 2 or 3 people to ever play Counter-Strike to try and become the best player to ever play CSGO. And that means you have to do things that the best players of all time did. So the one thing that is really conspicuously missing on Device's record is he has never been the dominant player in the situation where they were in the major final, where they were in the big semi-final of the major. He's never really been the player who just took over and was unstoppable entirely in the match. He can still be very good. He can still be a player who contributes to the system. But when you want to compete with Olaf Meisters, with Get Rights, with Kenny S, with Guardian, these are players who you put them in the biggest game of all time and they will be the best player. So there's still that level left to Device where it doesn't matter that they're the reigning major champions, that they're the ones who looked like they were going to have an era and be the team who defined what happened in the last year, 6 months of Counter-Strike. There's still something left for him to accomplish. Probably the most stable player in Astralis has to be Xyp9x. And this is a player who, despite their famous kind of reputation, the infamous element that do they choke, do they crumble under pressure, at the same time that people used to say that about them and they did have these issues, they had in Xyp9x easily one of the best players in pressure situations that CSGO has ever seen. This guy is legitimately like a robot. When you put him in a tough situation and you put him in a scenario where there's no clear answer as to what you do and to where whatever you decide to do now, you're then going to be faced with another decision that you're going to have to make an intelligent guess on what the opponent's going to do and what the correct play would be or the more efficient, what the more effective play to make would be. That's his world. That's the comfort zone for him. When he gets put in those situations, he knows the opponent's the one trying to figure it out, trying to solve the riddle. And so he's like a computer. You just put him in those situations and all he does again and again and again, he makes high percentage plays. He figures out what is the fundamentally sound way to play this situation out. What's the way that I can play it out where it gives me a good chance to win the round, it advances my position, it puts me in a better situation for my next decision, and also, here's a key element, it allows my opponent to make a mistake. And a lot of the rounds that Xyp9x wins, it's not some amazing duel where he beats the guy to the punch and hits a crazy headshot. It's not pulling out a Desert Eagle and killing someone halfway across the map. It looks like a very simple kill that anyone thinks they could get. But those are some of the hardest kills in the game to get because it's under pressure. It's in a 1v1. It's where both players have a sense for where the opponent is, but they're not certain what he's going to do. And so what Xyp9x does is he navigates himself around, he puts himself in good positions again and again and again, and he waits for the opponent to make that one mistake and give him that one opening, and then he just executes consistently from that scenario. And as such, no one can win every clutch round. But if you had your life on the line and you had to pick a player who's going to win a clutch round situation for you, you'd put your house on Xyp9x to win it. When you talk about Astralis, it's very difficult to discuss the team as a whole, the star players, the role players, who's the entry, the lurk, without discussing the guy who orchestrates the whole thing, the guy in charge of everything who makes the decisions, and that is Glaive. And Glaive himself has had a very tumultuous CSGO career, where in the early days, in 2013, he was the in-game leader of a team called Western Wolves, which was one of the most tactical teams of all time. Didn't have a high skill level, but they were famous for these really precise, intricate executes. And he was the mind behind all of that, putting those pieces on the chessboard and moving them out. But the key element for me and what he's been able to do in Astralis is that Astralis is nothing like the complexion of what that Western Wolves team was like, because actually the Astralis core comes from the rival team to Western Wolves. They come from a team called Copenhagen Wolves. And this was a squad which, yeah, they had this high skill level. They had a lot of young players who were developing and were going to go on to become some of the best players. But they originally played very much off their skill level. That's why they were such a good counter-terrorist team. And the raw aim and the ability level of all the players is one of the things that you were dealing with when you played them. So what I feel like Glaive brought to Astralis now is he brought this tactical element where one of the ways he freed up those skilled players from pressure and feeling like they had to play a certain way or overcome mental difficulties individually was by putting this framework behind them. He was able to make what's actually one of the most effective teams you've ever seen. That's the reason why they're on this incredible streak of top 4 finishes, because they're a team where, even though he has high-skilled players, there's not a lot of autonomy in the team. There's not players just making a bizarre play that they just decided instinctually, I'm just going to do that now. Or a player who's just saying, I'm going to break off from the tactic now. I'm going to go do something totally different, like I'm feeling the game. They don't run like that. Astralis run their tactics, and they read the game, and they try and make the correct plays as a team. And so managing to keep all those high-skilled players together is what makes them very effective, because they have the tactics, but they have a much higher skill level man for man than you're used to seeing on a very tactical team. Usually, tactics are there to make up the ground for the player who can't just win out a situation on his own every time. You have to put him in a more favorable situation. So I feel like that core element that Glaive's brought to Astralis is what makes them universally consistent and able to match up against pretty much every team in the game.